So in this video, we're going to look at motion tracking. Now motion tracking allows us to take a video clip that has camera movement within it, or the camera is static and an object or person is moving within it. This allows us to overlay elements and have them appear as if they were in this physical space. We can composite elements into the scene that weren't there physically or in camera. This is an incredibly powerful tool. We're also going to look at camera stabilization. What this means is that if the camera is handheld and there's some movement and it's too much movement and the footage is a little shaky, we can take that footage and stabilize it, creating the effect that it was filmed on a much smoother platform. We're going to look at stabilization first, so let's get to it. We're going to start by stabilizing motion. So here I've created a composition for my source video clip. And as you can see, it is quite shaky as the camera has been handheld. So what we're going to do first is we're going to look at stabilizing this footage. And the first method we're going to use is stabilizing motion. To do this, we're going to need the tracker panel. After Effects has lots of different functions and tabs and panels, and most of them aren't present all the time. So if we're looking for a specialist function, if we go to the window drop-down menu, we'll find all manner of options, and the one we're looking for is Tracker. We have 4 options within the Tracker panel. We can either track the camera, and that will read the movement so we can apply it to another object. So it's going to try and calculate how the camera has moved within 3D space, based on objects of interest, such as this television here. We can track motion, where we can spot an object within it or a point of interest, such as this corner here, and then stick something to that point so that will follow that location. We've got warp stabilize, which will distort the image to create a smoother looking footage. However, this can sometimes distort the image too much and result in footage that looks drunk, for a better description. And we have stabilize motion, which will analyze how the camera has moved, but then move the footage itself in the opposite direction to keep consistent smooth movement. Let's look at how we do this. We're going to start by stabilizing motion. This is the first type of track we're going to look at. So I'm going to select stabilize motion, and it's going to give me a tracker point. Now the tracker point consists of 2 boxes and a central point. So what we need to do is find a point of interest with contrast. For example, this corner here. We have good contrast between the grey and the black, and it is a geometric hard edge shape, so it's going to track really nicely. We take our tracker point and we move it over and place it on top. Now the inside box identifies what we are tracking. The outside box identifies how far it will move from one frame to the next. We ideally want to have this box as small as is practicable. So if we have it too big, it might find something that is similar and jump. And likewise, the inner box, we don't want it too large that it's referencing too amorphous an area. We want it small enough that it's only referencing accurate material, but not so small as to not be able to track something accurately. When we have one track point, we're not going to have a very accurate track. We're not going to have many axes of movement, as we're only measuring, in this instance, the position, which is the vertical, the Y, and the horizontal, the X. Now when we only track the position, we're only tracking the movement vertically, the Y-axis, and horizontally, the X-axis. This is perfectly fine if the camera is not moving. The person holding the camera is staying stationary. There's just a slight sway to their hand holding the camera. If they are pivoting or moving around an object, they will also need to track rotation. And if they're moving forwards or backwards, we'll also have to track scale, as objects will increase and decrease in scale within the frame. It will be dependent on the footage how many of the tracking options you select. In this instance, I'm going to also track the rotation. And when you track multiple things, such as the rotation and the position, we'll get multiple track points. And you see they are joined with a line. Ideally, what we want is to place them in a manner so that they're on the same face of an object. So I could place one in this corner and in this corner, But in this instance, I'm going to place it here as we have another fine point of contrast to track from. Once we've placed our track points, we come down to our tracker and then we analyze. We can analyze forwards and it'll play the footage. And you see, as it plays forwards, the tracking points are sticking to the objects we placed them on. If we had placed them poorly, they would jump around and end up in places where they're going to give an inaccurate track, as has just happened here. If that happens, we go to the point where it begins, and then we place the tracker back where we want it to be, tell it to analyze forwards again, and do the track in small chunks. This way, we can ensure an accurate track. And you see we're starting to replace the inaccurate information with the accurate. That's probably enough track for now. With that done, we're then going to select Apply. It'll ask us what dimensions we want to apply it to. X and Y, where it's going to move horizontally and vertically, or simply the X or the Y. Selecting only one of the axes isn't going to give us a very smooth track, so we're going to select the X and Y. Click OK. So as you can see, now we've applied that tracking data, we can play through, and the footage has now become incredibly smooth because it is moving the footage around your composition to compensate for the camera's movement. And in doing so, it can actually do some particularly strange things with very shaky footage in the way that it moves it around. So that's why we always want to try and use footage that isn't too shaky. I'm now going to go into my transform options, and we'll see that the position and the rotation of the clip has a keyframe for every single frame as it moves around. Scale, however, is unaffected because we didn't involve scale in our track. So I simply scale it up and track through my clip, ensuring no areas where it goes off the edge. This isn't always possible, and it's very much a garbage in, garbage out situation. There's only so much you can do with the tools available, and Stabilize Motion is the most rudimentary of those tools. Next, we're going to look at the Warp Stabilizer. The Warp Stabilizer works in a slightly different way, as it is an effect rather than a series of tracked keyframes. We apply it to the footage using the tracker panel. To do this, select the footage, go to the tracker panel, and select Warp Stabilizer. The effect will then be applied to the clip, and it will analyze the footage, automatically tracking and assessing where that movement is. It will then stabilize that footage based on certain criteria. We can dictate how much of it's moving and how it's going to do that once it is finished analyzing. The movement it will create will always fill the entire frame, but it's going to do that by distorting and stretching and duplicating pixels. And sometimes if the movement is too much, or if there's a lot of forward movement, it can start to pulse and fluctuate in odd manners. It's kind of uncanny, but basically it feels like it's a little bit drunk. The footage has now been analysed and is applied to smooth motion, so let's play that through. We'll have a look. So we have a very smooth track, very smooth footage now. Has a slightly floaty, weightless feel to the footage. And occasionally there's a slight kind of pulse or twitch to it. And sometimes you can get away with it. If there's not too much movement, it can do an excellent job. But if there's a lot, verticals and straight edges will start to kind of ripple and distort in a way that you wouldn't necessarily want. If we have a look at the effect options, we can dictate how it's going to produce that tracking. If we look at the effect options themselves, we can look at the different methods available to Warp Stabilizer to smooth your footage. Subspace Warp is the one that we've been discussing. However, you can also use Perspective and Precision Scale Rotation. These are very similar to the conventional motion track. However, they're not going to give as smooth a final outcome as the Subspace Warp. After that, we can adjust the smoothness, and if we reduce it, it will reapply the filter, and it will be less floaty, but there may be less aberrations there as well. It's not as floaty smooth, so that feels more like the camera is weighted. There's not as much of a weightless sense to the footage, but also straight edges have less wave to them as well. Conversely, if you require more stabilization, we simply increase the smoothness. But as previously discussed, the more we are stabilizing this footage with Warp Stabilize, and the subspace warp in particular, the more weightless and wavy straight edges will start to become, especially the more extreme the movement. And that's the Warp Stabilizer. Now we've looked at stabilizing shaky footage, let's have a look at tracking the motion and applying that motion to other things. So we can place other elements into a scene and make them appear like they were really there. The next motion track we're going to perform is a pretty common use case for this sort of technique. Quite often we have a screen or a wall or a sign and we need to change the artwork that's on it or place something on that screen. And we do that by again tracking the motion. We're going to use a special kind of track called a perspective corner pin. So let's look at how that functions. As of all tracks, start by selecting your clip and going to the tracker panel. We're going to track motion, and we get our single track point. If we then look closer at the tracker panel, we'll notice there's an entry called track type, and we get a variety of different options. And we're going to select perspective corner pin. This will then give us 4 conjoined track points, and we're going to place these in the 4 corners of the surface that we want to apply our image to. We need to ensure that they're all in the same plane. So say this corner and this corner wouldn't work because they're not on the same plane. It'd be each corner of the screen. They have to be visible at all times for this to work. And again, we want that clear corner of contrast. But apart from that, it's fairly straightforward. The individual track points function in the exact same way as a normal one does. So I can place each one in a corner. And I'll ensure that the conjoining lines run along the edge of where I want that artwork to appear. Now I keep referring to artwork, but it doesn't matter if it's a still image or a video clip. With that done, we're going to track through. So I now have my track data. We need to apply this to something. So let's get another asset and add it to our composition, and then apply that motion data to that asset. In my project, I have this time clock. I will add it to my composition. I'll then go back to the layer where all my tracking data is. Notice my composition and layer views are different, and all of the tracking data for an individual clip is accessible within the isolated layer view. So if you're ever in the composition and you're trying to get back to edit or adjust the tracker, simply double click on that layer and it'll open an isolated layer view, and we get all the tracking stuff back. So I've added the video clip we're going to apply this motion track to. I'm going to come back to my tracker panel. Here I'm going to select Edit Target. And when I do that, this pop-up will appear and I can select whatever layer in my composition I want to use. In this case, there's only one other layer, so I'll select that one. And then I click Apply. If I then turn this layer back on, I will now see that that layer has been distorted so that each corner sticks to where one of those tracking points is, thus creating the illusion that it is on the screen. However, it doesn't feel fully embedded in the footage. It may track perfectly, however, it doesn't feel like it's on the screen. It doesn't feel like it is in person. And this is where our position as artists comes in, where we have to look at things and analyze and think about what can we do to this video clip to make it feel more embedded in the shot. It is black and white. We might look around and notice that the black here is a deeper, richer black than the darkest black in the frame. So that reads wrong. Also, if we have a look at the original shot, there's reflection present. So let's look at what we can do to make this image look more embedded within the original shot and that it's actually on the screen. The first thing I'm going to do is simply change the blend mode of this layer. I'm going to change it to soft light. This will allow the original reflection that is on the original shot to shine through a little bit, it'll knock the black back and it'll no longer be a richer black than the darkest element within the original shot. And that already is feeling a lot more like it's embedded and present. The next thing I'm going to do is, this is a screen, this is backlit. So I'm going to add a simple glow effect. And if we look very closely, we'll notice that this is actually sharper than the next sharpest thing in the frame. This text should be no sharper than this text. So I'm going to get a basic blur and input a very small amount of blur so that it is as close as possible in fidelity to the other elements within the frame. And let's play that through and have a look. Now, it might not have crossed the uncanny valley in terms of an effect shot. However, it is not bad for a first pass, and it is looking quite good in terms of being in the shot. And there's more we can do to really sell this. But for a first pass, it's not bad. Next, we're going to look at another form of track called a 3D camera track. So let's look at the 3D camera tracker. Now, this tracker works differently to all the other forms of tracker. It is an effect that we apply to a clip. It analyzes the motion, and then it allows us to generate a virtual camera. Now, so far in After Effects, we've only been working in 2 dimensions, utilizing layers to decide what is in front. However, After Effects can also operate within a 3D space, and we can place things within a virtual 3-dimensional environment, as well as camera lens effects such as depth of field, to dictate the overall look. What's so powerful about the 3D camera tracker is that we're able to track the motion really accurately and then place an object within that virtual 3-dimensional space. The virtual camera that's been created, if successful, will follow the same path of movement as the physical camera did in the real world. That way we can place something within 3-dimensional space, and as the camera moves, perspective will move with it. So let's see how it works, and let's place some text within this 3-dimensional space. We'll start as always with a composition with our source footage. And I'm going to come up to the Effects and Presets panel, and I'm going to search for 3D camera tracker, and I'll apply that to my clip. It will then analyze the footage in the background. The longer the clip, the longer this will take. Once it has generated the tracking data, as we scrub through, we'll see all of these little crosshairs appearing and disappearing. These are the automatically generated points of interest. These are all little points that the tracker can track for some portion of time. As you move your mouse across, it will try and join these together, creating a target. What you want to try and achieve is a combination of 3 of these that will create a target that is on the correct plane. So for example, be in the correct orientation as this screen. You don't want it squint, you don't want it at an odd angle, you want it so it feels like it's on the side of it, for example. If it doesn't automatically pull a target that does that, you can manually select, and holding the Shift key, select a number of tracking points to create a really solid track. I'm going to keep all these on the same plane, the same side of the box, so that it's not going to get confused by rotation. With my target selected, I have 2 options. I can either select Create Camera from the effect itself, and that will generate a 3D camera that I can then bring new assets into. I can also control click on my target, and it'll give me a number of options. These options are generally speaking the ones we will use most. And I'm going to tell it to create text and a camera. And the text will be in line with that target. So as we play through, it'll look like it's stuck to the side there. But I'm going to place my text here in front of the table. If I now select my text, you'll notice it has these 3 arrows. These indicate the 3 dimensions we can move this in: the horizontal, the vertical, and the depth, X, Y, and Z. If I take my rotation tool, I can now rotate on these axes. And what I want to do is rotate my object until it is in line. What I want to do is rotate this object until it is in line with something in the same plane. So for example, I'm going to use this line across here to align my text. So I'm going to move it in. And when I'm happy that it aligns along that line and down the side so that I know it's square, I'm just going to then place it in the environment. Might just rotate it a touch there just to fine tune. So it looks right. And as I play through, it'll move in the same perspective. The text has the 3-dimensionality to it. You can then take it to the next level and add what are called shadow catchers and light to it so that it's casting a shadow within its space. But that's more detail for another time, as we're going to cover 3D space in a lot more detail, including lights and shadow, in a future video. We've covered a lot of ground in this video, but I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you in the next one.